Evening and welcome to our public forum on school funding and property taxes, two issues that are not only certain to be on the minds of voters throughout New Hampshire as they cast their ballots this fall, but they're also quite likely to be near the top of next year's legislative agenda as well. My name is Jeff McLynch, and I'm the project director of the New Hampshire School Funding Fairness Project, a nonprofit advocacy organization that seeks to inform the public about the system New Hampshire uses to fund its public schools and that advocates for reforms to make that system more equitable and sustainable. I'll serve as both your host and moderator for tonight's forum. Our forum will consist of three parts. First, I'll begin with a brief overview of New Hampshire's school funding system and some of the problems now before it. And following that overview, we'll be joined by two guests, Stephanie Gilson and Dwight LaFontaine. Stephanie recently retired after spending 34 years as an educator, 32 of which were in Newport, New Hampshire. And during her career, she held 3 professional certifications in physical education, elementary education, and special education, and also served as the president of the Newport Teachers Association. Dwight LaFontaine is the director of operations for 51 Jiffy Mart and T-Bird locations across Western New Hampshire and into Vermont. He's a lifelong Newport resident, where he's had an extensive tenure on the town's budget advisory committee. Stephanie and Dwight will each share their perspectives on how the shortcomings of New Hampshire school funding system affects their community. Next, we'll turn to candidates for the New Hampshire House of Representatives and Senate, as well as a candidate, I believe, who's joined us from the Executive Council, so that they can offer their own remarks about school funding. I'll recognize candidates in alphabetical order, given the number of candidates who have indicated they wish to speak, I would ask that folks try to keep their remarks to about 2 minutes, and I'll offer a gentle reminder as your time has elapsed. And then we'll open the floor to questions from the public for the candidates in attendance. We've received a few questions from members of the public in advance, and so we'll try to ask those first. But if there are members of the audience who would like to pose a question, you can do so via the Q&A feature that's available on Zoom, and we'll try to work those in as time allows. Now, before I make more introductions and get everything underway, I do want to mention a couple of logistical items. First, for the non-candidate attendees tonight, they will be muted throughout the duration of the forum. But if we do have time at the end, we'll try to recognize them directly to ask questions. And then secondly, tonight's forum is being recorded. We'll share that recording with each of you, hopefully no later than tomorrow morning. And we'll post it to the School Funding Fairness website so that those unable to attend will still have the benefit of hearing what everyone had to say. The event will also be rebroadcast on Claremont and Newport Community Television. And we thank them for joining in tonight. So with that out of the way, why don't I run through the candidates who have registered to take part this evening. We'll start with James Beard, who's a candidate for the 2nd Executive Council District. And then our Senate candidates, Jen Alford Teester from Senate District 8, Jean Deach from Senate District 9, Jay Kahn, Senate District 10, and from the 5th Senate District, Suzanne Prentice. Our House candidates registered for this evening are Michael Abbott from Cheshire 1, Jean Anderson from Cheshire 11, Judy Aaron from Sullivan 7, from the 10th Sullivan District, John Cloutier, the 5th Sullivan, Liza Draper, Virginia Dry from Sullivan 1, Margaret Dry from Sullivan 9, Sue Gottling from Sullivan 2, from the 7th Sullivan, Claudia Istel, from the 1st Sullivan, Tanya McIntyre, Toby Menard is from the Sullivan 9th District, Gary Merchant is from Sullivan's 4th District, Lucius Parshall from Cheshire 10, from Cheshire 16 we have Joe Shapiro, from Sullivan 5 we have Walter Stapleton, John Streeter joins us from Sullivan 8, and Brian Sullivan joins us from Sullivan 1. And from Sullivan 9, we have Linda Tanner. And I actually managed to get through the entire list without butchering anybody's name. Congratulations, all. With that out of the way, I know everyone is very eager to hear what you have to say about school funding and property taxes, but I do want to sort of offer a few remarks at the start just to inform the conversation. And of course, before I do that, I'd be really remiss if I didn't recognize 2 members of the New Hampshire School Funding Fairness Project Board of Directors who are with us tonight, Karen Hatcher and Kathy Hubert. I want to thank them for being a part of tonight's event. So let me share my screen here. Wonderful. So we hope that tonight's conversation, pardon me, we hope that tonight's conversation will foster an ongoing dialogue about school funding here in New Hampshire, because really, in one way or another, that system touches the lives of just about everybody in the Granite State. Our school funding system is certainly of immense importance to New Hampshire's school children, represented here by this group of students from Berlin, who put together this banner in a graphics art class and marched in a local parade to call attention to the challenges that their schools have faced in recent years. That system is certainly important to New Hampshire's homeowners and property taxpayers generally, homeowners and renters included, as well as local businesses. For while they may understand the value of investing in New Hampshire's schools and see the value in investing in our shared future, they're finding it harder and harder to do so as property taxes rise ever higher and place greater strains on their budgets. So in any conversation about school funding in New Hampshire, we at the School Funding Fairness Project really think that there are three important issues to keep in mind. And the first is New Hampshire's constitutional responsibilities for school funding. The second is the role of property taxes in funding schools and the inequities that arise as a result. And third is the enormous gap between actual school costs in state aid. And I want to touch on each of those topics in turn. The first, when it comes to constitutional responsibilities, I probably don't have to tell many people on this call that there have been a number of Supreme Court cases in recent decades that have dealt with this issue. And those cases, dating to at least the Claremont cases in the late 1990s, have really established two fundamental responsibilities for New Hampshire. First, that the state has a duty to pay for the cost of a constitutionally adequate education for every K-12 public school student. And subsequent cases subsequent to Claremont, in particular the Londonderry case in 2006, really underscored this responsibility, basically saying that whatever the state defines as constitutional adequacy, it must pay for. The second responsibility is that the taxes that the state of New Hampshire uses to pay for this education must have a uniform rate across the state. And the Supreme Court has even gone so far as to single out property taxes as a tax that has to have a uniform rate as well. And it's somewhat natural that the court might do that because property taxes, and in particular local property taxes, are really the driving force behind school funding in New Hampshire. This chart here shows that in the 2018-2019 school year, about $3.3 billion flowed into local school districts for the purposes of educating our school children. Of that total, 73% came from local property taxes, or 7 out of every $10. So, the overwhelming share. And, given that sort of preponderance of local property taxes, it's natural to ask, well, how did that come about, or why is that the case? Well, the simple reason is that New Hampshire, as a state, contributes less to its public schools than any other state in the nation. Here we see the 50 states arrayed by their contribution to local school districts. And if you look to the right, you see states like Hawaii and Vermont, which contribute more than 80% of the revenues at the state level into local districts. That stands in sharp contrast to New Hampshire, which is on the far left. There you see that New Hampshire only contributes about 20% of total local revenues. If you were to count the swept in that total, that would necessarily boost that percentage, but really the swept is really just relabeled local tax, so it's not accurate to include it there as well. And this reliance on local property taxes has only gotten worse over time. If you look back over the last 10 years or so, what you see is that to the extent there have been growth in revenues for local school districts, it's almost entirely occurred within local taxation to the tune of about $570 million over that 10-year span. State adequacy aid did grow modestly during that time, but that increase was almost entirely offset, or at least by more than half, by declines in other state sources of revenue, like school building assistance. Now, this particular problem or reliance on property taxes might not be such a great problem if it were the case that the number of students were distributed evenly across New Hampshire and property values were distributed evenly across the state. But as this table makes abundantly clear, they're not. Here we have a sort of a set of examples in New Hampshire, and it really underscores the fact that there are wide disparities in property values throughout New Hampshire, and as a result, wide disparities in property tax rates and districts' ability to fund education. Just to give you some specifics, if you look at the top, take a place like Moulton Borough in 2018, 2019, Moulton Borough had an equalized property value per pupil of about $7 million. That measure, equalized value per pupil, is really just meant to represent what is available in that community to help support education, or what is their tax base. As a result of that having $7 million per pupil in equalized value, Moulton Borough was able to impose a tax rate of under $4 per thousand in that year, but yet still generate more than $26,000 per pupil for education. Contrast that with Newport. Newport that same year had equalized value of only about $555,000 per pupil. As a result, it had to use a rate of about $15 per thousand, and yet was only able to generate about $8,300 per student. So really, you have much higher tax rates between these two areas, yet the area with the lower rate, because of its high property values, was able to dedicate more resources to educating its kids. And this sort of occurs throughout the state, and we could talk more about that later if you like. That disparity has grown over time as well. While state property values overall have grown on the order of about 5% over roughly the last 10 years, there's been communities where property values have skyrocketed, places like Portsmouth or Hanover, where it's grown by 20, 30, 40%. In contrast, in places like Pittsfield or Claremont, we've seen property values decline over that period. And as a result, just to tread water, just to have even a level budget, communities that have seen declining property values have had to increase their tax rates just to tread water and keep their heads above water. And really, they've had those ever increasing rates to stay level because the state, as we see here, is not contributing nearly as much towards the cost of an adequate education as it ought to. This table here sort of lays out a simplified calculation of how the cost of adequacy is determined. And in the interest of time, I won't delve into too many details, but I do want to call your attention to the two rightmost columns. At the far right, what you see is what local school districts are actually spending on a per student basis. So in the highlighted area, Derry is spending a little bit more than $15,000 per pupil in this year. However, the state says that the cost of an adequate education in Derry is really just $4,600 per kid. And we're not cherry picking here when we list these communities. You could do this for just about any place in the state. And really, so we've tried to we at the Fair Funding Project have tried to understand, what this gap means, and the way we've gone about it is we've asked the question, well, what would it take? What would districts have to give up to get down to that cost of adequacy, or what the state says the cost of adequacy? So we worked with school districts, we worked with school officials in Pittsfield to go through an exercise where we examined their budget and asked that very question. In the 2018-2019 school year in Pittsfield, their total school district budget was a little bit more than $10.3 million, or about $17,000 per student. Yet again, the state said, well, you should be able to provide an adequate education for a little bit more than $4,600 per student. So what would you have to take out in Pittsfield's budget to get to that level? Well, I've got 3 pages of hypothetical eliminations here. I won't read through each one, but in this exercise, and I should emphasize at the start, we tried to keep core classrooms intact, core educational services intact. We'll see whether that was the case or not in the end. But we started by eliminating all school nurses, all regular transportation services, all art, music, physical education classes, building and grounds maintenance, all foreign language courses. We also eliminated half of the custodians, as well as all of the athletic programs, any field trips, all substitute teachers, all technology personnel, equipment, training, software, everything in that vein. And we also got rid of all the guidance personnel, the substance abuse counselor, any librarians and media center staff, as well as office supplies, copier maintenance, you name it. Even after making all of these reductions, the remaining budget was still twice what the state said you should be able to provide an adequate education for at about $5.3 million to the state's $2.7 million. So to get down to that state level, we would have had to eliminate half of the teachers still left in that district, bringing the student-teacher ratio to 60-1. I think it's a fair question to ask how anybody can claim that this would provide an adequate education for the students of Pittsfield and really any place in the state. So given these facts that we've reviewed tonight, it shouldn't come as much as a surprise that the most recent really comprehensive assessment of New Hampshire's school funding system confirms these inequities. As many of you may know, there's a commission, the Commission to Study School Funding, that's been meeting for the past 6 months or so. Actually, I guess it's closer to 9 months now. But they engaged a national consulting firm, the American Institutes of Research, to look at our system and to help it understand what it would cost to provide an adequate education. And in their draft report, they had a few key findings, one of which I've presented here. And I just want to read it because it's really just so clear as to our problem. The state's current system, they said, is inequitable from both student and taxpayer perspectives. The districts serving the highest proportion of students who are economically disadvantaged spend less on average compared with districts serving the fewest such students. Moreover, the districts with the least property wealth per student impose the highest local education tax rates to be able to fund their children's education. So that's obviously a lot of information, a lot of facts and figures. And I'd like to turn now to Stephanie and Dwight to sort of explain what that might mean on a day-to-day basis in their community. And so with that, Stephanie, perhaps you could lead us off.
Thank you. I think that, first of all, I'd like to thank everyone for being a part of this huge discussion. And I can kind of sum things up in just a few words and then explain. And basically, from my perspective as an educator in Newport, is the fact that due to much of the funding of public education being locally raised through property taxes, we in Newport have seen, from the education perspective, a negative downward spiral in our community, which is actually related millions of years ago to the fact that the glacier didn't leave a mountain or a lake for our tax base. And so then we find that because of that, our budgets are frequently slashed or not passed, leaving the schools with a lack of funding to provide all programs. Another thing that happened was the state changed from helping to fund the staff retirement system to putting the burden on the individual town. And once that happened, our already limited resources were then diverted from directly impacting student education. So overall, we've seen programs and services cut, and that leads to another step in the fact that parents who can remove their children from the public school, and they either homeschool them or send them to a private school nearby. And that leaves the schools without strong, supportive, and involved families. That further spirals down to the community seeing our schools as failing and not doing well, and therefore the school gets a bad reputation. That continues the spiral because now real estate companies publish out that our schools are not doing well, and that frightens potential homeowners. So then they buy in surrounding towns with a broader tax base, more funding, and more supportive families. As far as I see administrators, teachers, and staff working extremely hard. I see teachers and staff providing basic resources out of their own pockets. That means supplies, online resources, and even paying for field trips for children because they've been reduced from the budget. We used to, when I started in Newport in 1988, I believe it was, we had field trips built into our budget. Then they were cut down to 1 per class. And then these last few years, we've actually had to say to parents, we need you to pay the entry fee for for a field trip and to contribute towards the busing costs. I taught 4th grade last, and we deliberately chose, because so many of our children are culturally deprived, to take them to theater at the Lebanon Opera House or to the Hopkins Center. And I can tell you that I not only needed to pay for myself, but I also paid for several students in my class to be able to attend those because their parents could not or did not send in the funding for that. So we also share resources among us. But one of the major things is we haven't purchased enough of those. So for example, in the 4th grade, we had about 90 students, but we only had 25 social studies textbooks based called New Hampshire, Our Home, which is a wonderful New Hampshire oriented textbook, but we only had 25 of those for 90 students. And we didn't have the money to get more. So now how are we supposed to adequately schedule our time so that we can use that resource among so many? I've also noticed that after a few years, our staff, once they gained experience, and this is both administration and our teaching staff as well as aides, once they've gained experience, they leave Newport. We have considered ourselves a training ground. They find districts that have higher wages, more money for resources, more supplies, and a more diverse student body. People then, our staff is moving out of town themselves, raising their children and making another town nearby with a broader tax base their permanent home. In my 32 years, I've been through 9 superintendents and 11 principals that I can actually name. And there are a few that I'm sure I've forgotten. When I first began teaching there, our leaders lived locally. They were part of our local community. Now, most are not. They have left the area and come just to work. So in closing, I want you to know that I know the answer to this situation isn't easy, but I also know that the system to fund New Hampshire schools needs to change and be overhauled in a major way. So I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts and ideas on that, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. Dwight, we'll turn to you now.
Yes, Stephanie did a really great job of sort of highlighting the last 30 years of Newport, I think, which I've lived it as well. And I'm going to just talk real briefly about 2 different angles, perspectives. One is I was and still am involved in the budget committee in Newport. I was chairman for way too many years. And the other is from the business perspective. I'm just going to stick with those 2, but I did live what she just spoke, as my wife is just retired recently from as an educator in Newport for many, many years. But I'll just take it from the budget committee part first. It is all the facts and figures, Jeff, that you gave. I won't rehash any of them, but they're all true, and many of us have had to really live that. And what it does is you see a community making choices, sacrificing and becoming harder and harder to keep the standards of that community up. And towns like Newport and Claremont and others that are disadvantaged, for the most part, they make those choices for the right reasons and for the right, place in their heart, and they actually sacrifice much more if you look at the actual numbers. And it pits neighbor against neighbor and so forth. And I could bore all of you to complete death with the figures, but the real truth is it just isn't damn fair. And it's not sustainable. When you look at, from my perspective in the business community, I've got 13 pieces of real estate that are businesses in Sullivan County and Cheshire County. Last year, we paid in $545,671 in property taxes. And property taxes are just one form of tax that we do. But the real issue that I want to stress is the inequity of it. I'm comparing like stores to like stores. And in one town, they can be, the lowest one was $9,620. And the highest one was $68,042. Now, as a business person and dealing with numbers and ratios, like I'm sure many of you do, you're going to pick and choose, where do I want to make the investment in my properties? All things being equal, you would naturally pick the town where you won't be penalized for the big investment. And I'm afraid if this continues, because it's escalating, that scenario is going to make businesses actually start to make decisions. That expense of more than $500,000 was about our fourth largest line item, after payroll and healthcare, and then it was property taxes. The one that is escalating fastest is property taxes as a percentage, and it's scary for where it will go. So I've been a firm believer. I'm so happy that this group has gotten together to do this. It is clear to me that the New Hampshire advantage is wonderful in some of the towns you mentioned, if you live in Sunapee or Hanover. But it's actually a New Hampshire disadvantage, and we need to, if property taxes become the thing of the future, we need to make it fair, because the thing is not fair whatsoever. And businesses will make choices, and the poorer towns will become poorer. I would be happy to answer anything, but I don't think I'll go on more than that. But you did a great job with your PowerPoints. I read some of them again just before I came here, and it's clear as day.
Well, Dwight, thank you so much. And definitely thank you as well for sharing your insights. We'll turn to the candidates now to hear their views, but Dwight, if you're able to stay, and if folks want to pose questions, we'll call on you. But for now, we'll start with James Beard, who's running for executive counselor in the 2nd District. James, was there a comment you want to offer? I believe you're still muted. Yep, there you go.
Yeah. Can I hear you now?
I can hear you now.
Very good. I appreciate the forum that you put together, Jeff. First of all, I am born and raised in New Hampshire. I was born in Keene, and my childhood was actually in Newport. And my dad was a teacher over at Sunapee High School, teaching woodworking. And my mom, she was the secretary for the principal in Newport. So I grew up in a Newport area education up until about the 4th, 5th grade. And I just have so many fond memories of what Newport used to be like. And I'm working currently with a person you may know, Jay Lucas, on a revitalization of Newport. And the whole objective is really to bring new opportunity to Newport through the high school and offering new opportunities for the young people to create jobs and live and stay in Newport once they leave high school. But funding on the other side, I believe very much in the sense of competition is a reality. Many parents, especially after this COVID situation have been, forced to look at education differently. They have to look at homeschooling, which I support tremendously. They have to look at private education, and that's where the competition comes in. So we're really at a crossroads on how we fund public education in the future. And I hope that this discussion, as we continue it, will bring some of that forbearance into the discussion. So I'll leave it at that. I'm obviously happy to take questions, but that's kind of a background issue that I have.
Sure. Well, thank you for sharing that. We'll come to some questions after folks have had a chance to offer their views, and we hope you'll be able to stay with us. We're going to turn to Jen Alford-Teester, who is from Senate District 8. Oh, Jen, you're still muted.
I feel like we should have a Zoom bingo, and that would be the top thing. You're still muted. Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's nice to see you again for the third round of this. I'm really grateful that you're targeting the communities the way that you're doing this. My name is Jen Alford-Teester. I'm running for New Hampshire State Senate District 8. I know many of you. I see friends here like John Streeter and Linda Tanner, see John Lund, John Cloutier, all of our friends here, and Senator Deitch, and I think I saw Jay Kahn on here somewhere, and Suzanne Prentice, so exciting. I was born and raised in New Hampshire, grew up here, with a single mom who had 3 kids before she was 18, and my brother at 23. We lived in poverty my entire childhood. When I moved to North Carolina at 18, I did so with $265 and 2 suitcases, and found myself making $4.35 an hour at a coffee shop. And I'd been there about a year, and I'd passed out at work because I could not afford to eat every day. And the folks I worked for encouraged me to go to college, which at the time I thought was only for rich kids. And but in North Carolina, it was $2,000 a semester to go to school. So I had applied for UNCG, worked 2 and 3 jobs, put myself through my undergraduate degree, earned a scholarship for my first master's degree, came home to New Hampshire, got a second master's degree, and now I've been at the Geisel School of Medicine for the last 14 years and I'm now a senior research scientist there. And that's a special designation for staff who are, basically hold a faculty position, and there are not very many of them. So I've achieved much in my career. And I tell you this because I strongly believe that the well-funded public education system that I grew up in, despite the fact that I was poor, made all that difference in my readiness when I came to earn a job. And so for me, when I think about public education, I think about it as the return on investment that it really is. And during COVID right now, when we're looking at people who are having to balance working and homeschooling, we have so many infrastructure issues related to be able to do that and do remote care. I think the active defunding of public education is a disservice to the future of the kids who live in the state. Talk about you're looking at the return on investment of a well-funded school district. This is what you want for kids. You want this for the future of our state. And I decided to run for state senate in 2018 because of that, because people needed to be able to see the return on investment for the advocacy for a well-funded school district, because there are many people who are actively working against that because they don't see the return on investment. I am now making a 6-figure salary at the Geisel School of Medicine instead of living out of a truck like my mother. So for me, public education from a personal standpoint and from my professional standpoint, I study these issues at the large geographies. I can advocate for funding for public education, so that's why I'm running for state senate. I'm very passionate about this, so happy to take any questions when the floor is opened. But good to see many of you, and I know many of you know this story about me, so I'm sure you took a mental vacation while I was telling that story yet again.
Thank you, Jen. We'll turn now to Senator Jean Deitch.
Thank you very much, Jeff, and thank you for having me again. I am so dedicated to reducing disparity in this state that I've seen climb in the 36 years that I've lived here. And I appreciate greatly the AIR report that Jeff referred to, in which it proposes some solutions to this issue that would make both funding and revenue raising more fair. The figures that he's shown, only begin with the story that we heard from Dwight. They only begin to tell what's going on in our state and in our nation. And the idea that we're going to defund public schools when public schools are the basis for any thriving economy in the world. Without public school, I could never have started my 3 companies. And how many other entrepreneurs and small business people are there like me? Certainly my father was the same way. He was like Jen, he started out homeless and ended up owning a company. It's the basis for our nation, and the idea that school choice, that having taxpayers hand parents money that they can then give to religious or private or for-profit schools, which I think I believe if you look at the evidence, you'll see they're the ones who are behind this. We have companies like K-12 whose share value, you've got $1 billion company and its share value went up 30% when Betsy DeVos became Secretary of Education, because they knew that if they got school choice, that they were going to make a lot of money. Well, they spend probably 20% of their budgets on marketing. Okay, what does the school have to advertise with the great job it's doing? The Conval schools where I live are amazing, but they don't have anyone going out and telling the public about this. And so we end up with a second-class education for the kids who can only do remote, who can only afford remote, who only have the money that they're going to get from the scholarships, and they have to hand it over to K-12 or another commercial venture, and they're going to miss out on all the sports and the theater and the construction classes and all the hands-on learning because they have to go to cut-rate school. I think this is a specious choice, saying that choice is going to provide freedom to the parents. When it turns the teachers into Uber drivers, you sit home and you provide your own computer, you provide your own broadband, and you can work for a low salary and with no benefits and no job security. That's the future, and there's no reason that teacher has to be in the US. The teacher can be anywhere in the world. So that's the future that is ahead of us if we head down the path that our school choice advocates are putting before us. And I certainly am not for that.
Thank you, Senator. We'll turn to Suzanne Prentice next.
I'm off mute. Okay.
There you go.
Great. Good to see you again, Jeff, and thank you for the opportunity to join in this discussion tonight. I think we've all heard this. Adequate education in New Hampshire, it's not just about, it's about justice, and it highlights the inequity from community to community based on the current structure of how we fund education. That's why we're all here. It's clear and it's just unfair. This is not just about an adequate education. This is about an excellent education, accessible to all, regardless of zip code. If we keep nipping around the edges and not face the funding issue head on, then time will continue to stand still for New Hampshire students, for New Hampshire families, and for New Hampshire's workforce. My vision, and large part why I'm running for the state senate here in District 5, is to create prosperous, inclusive communities with thriving public education at its core. It's not enough just to fund it. It's what we're going to do with the funding and how we're going to create the structure that wraps around an entire community, From programs like Success at 6 to reaching the full potential as young adults, fair funding becomes part of New Hampshire's economic long view. My daughter went to public school here in New Hampshire. And as somebody, I didn't go to public school here in New Hampshire, but I have, as an EMT instructor, traveling throughout the state, I've had the opportunity to be in many of the buildings, and just wanted to touch on one part of this, which has to do between the disparities between communities and the buildings and their facilities. Now I live in Lebanon, we have a brand new middle school, and we've really had to fight hard for that, and our property taxes show it. But as we all know, building aid has been decimated, and I've seen schools where bathrooms have been turned into special education classrooms, where when children or young adults are on one floor running in a sporting activity, material from the ceiling right below it is falling on who's ever in the area below that. So the time is here. We know we have this Commission on School Funding, which has released a draft report. We're waiting for their final report. We know we've had 2 Supreme Court cases. We know we have another one that is pending, and we all know we can do better, or we wouldn't be part of this discussion tonight and running for public office. So thank you very much for this opportunity, and I look forward to any questions should they come. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Suzanne. We'll turn to House candidates now, and I believe Michael Abbott, you'll lead off.
Okay, my name is Michael Abbott. I've served for 15 years as a social studies teacher at Hinsdale High School and 15 years as the principal. I think the biggest thing, and I'm preaching to the choir, is what needs to happen is you folks need to get folks to vote so that we have a majority, a super majority in the House of Representatives, in the Senate, to pass a bill which adequately funds education. The property tax is the most regressive tax in the world. It pits old people like me who don't have kids at school against kids. It's wrong. And in response to a questionnaire I received from the Keene Sentinel, and they asked what I would do about school funding. I said what I thought would be the best way to do it. There's no way you're going to get a state income tax or a sales tax. That's not going to happen. What I suggested was to have a capital gains tax for people who make over $20,000 a year in capital gains go to school funding. Right now, I know the governor and the administration has appealed the decision of the court, saying that it's not up to to the legislature or anybody else to address the school funding issue. And they don't want to pay for ancillary services. But I know in communities like Hinsdale, Claremont, Newport, Pittsfield, it's this, or Berlin, probably the prime example. This is a real issue. And it involves kids. And I don't need to reiterate what other people have said, so I'll just leave it at that.
All right, well, thank you so much. Judy Aaron, you'll be our next speaker. Judy, I'm afraid you're muted still. There you are.
So good evening. My name is Judy Aaron, and I'm the state representative for Sullivan County District 7, representing Ackworth, Goshen, Langdon, Leominster, and Washington. I'm running for re-election in my district this year, and I'm joining in on this education funding forum tonight to listen to the concerns and share ideas regarding education funding in New Hampshire. We all know education funding can be a complicated, emotional, and sticky issue. But, you know, we all have to work together to find solutions that allow parents to choose what works best for their children and also provide sensible and realistic spending on education. I don't believe that any child should be stuck in an education model that's inadequate or doesn't work for them. And no family should be taxed out of their home either. So we have to have these discussions to see where we can strike a balance. And to be honest, I'm more interested to hear what folks have to say tonight and to listen and perhaps see where there might be some sorts of legislative solutions that we can craft from it. But we have to work together and not be pitted one against other, that one model is bad and another model is good and that sort of thing. We really need to work to listen to one another. I think I moved here from Connecticut 7 years ago. And Connecticut had the same sorts of issues. They had the Sheff versus O'Neill lawsuit that probably is still going on. I think every state has some sort of lawsuits going on claiming that there's inequality from town to town or county to county or district to district with regard to funding, with regard to curriculum and that sort of thing. So this is not something unique to New Hampshire, first of all. I don't think that our current tax burden is going to be lowered by adding on new taxes or new revenue schemes. I think, you know, when we get places like Connecticut, property taxes didn't go down when they added in a state income tax or a state sales tax, or a capital gains tax for that matter. In fact, their tax burden now is the highest that it's ever been and continues to spiral out of control. I will always advocate for more efficient use of state and county tax dollars. I fully support maintaining a New Hampshire advantage. I think that
Representative Aaron, I'm sorry to interrupt.
I'm sorry.
I'll let you finish that thought, but I do want to make sure we're allowing sufficient time for everybody.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll wrap up because I think the New Hampshire advantage is why people move here. They work here and they do business here and they vacation here. And so I think we need to be prudent with our state budget, just like every other New Hampshire's family that deals with their own family budget. And but I'm here, I want to listen to what the concerns are and what some people are saying. So thank you for having me today.
Thank you for being here. Up next is John Cloutier.
Everybody hear me?
You bet.
Oh, yes, John Cloutier from Claremont. I guess I have the distinction, first of all, probably being the most senior legislator here. I've been in the House since 1992. Basically, the same length of time as the first Claremont decision in 93, and then the second one in 97. And this is an issue that the legislature has struggled for years and years and years. And we struggled, and it's not really so much a partisan issue because both Democrats and Republicans have come up with good ideas, but unfortunately, in the end, the governor and the legislature have not been able to agree with those ideas. And I believe in keeping an open mind. That's why I don't take the pledge against any broad-based taxes, and I'm open to other ideas, as Representative Abbott earlier alluded to. But the important thing is hopefully the commission that we created in the budget is going to come up with a solution we can all rally around. I mean, I'm optimistic. I don't know, maybe I'm wrong. But as a person who's been in the legislature, and by the way, I'm also a Claremont native, so I've seen the struggles of my home community dealing with education. I also happen to be a substitute teacher in addition to being a rep. So I've seen the struggles that the staff, the teaching staff has. But one thing I'm very adamant about, I'm against any constitutional amendment to roll back the Claremont decisions until we get a solution that works for this state. We've got to keep the pressure. And if that means judicial pressure, I'm no constitutional amendment. That's my bottom line. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Our next speaker will be Liza Draper.
Hello, everyone. I thank everyone for being here tonight. This is my first such forum, and it's really exciting to hear the different points of view. I'm running for the first time for the State House seat in District 5, which is Claremont's Ward 3. I've been a resident of Ward 3 for almost 20 years. I raised 2 of my 4 children here, and they went through from Disnard to Claremont Middle School to Stevens High School and on and out to success. So much like Jen was speaking of earlier, I see education as the critical lever to move people forward. And it's essential that we do what we must to make an adequate education, and even an excellent one, available to everyone. I've taught in the Claremont school system, and as a public health educator, I have visited schools throughout Sullivan County, Grafton County, and other parts of the state. There is a real difference. There is a difference in the way we are able to reward our teachers. There's a difference in the curriculum we're able to offer. There's a difference in the resources our kids can count on, and that's wrong. So I'm hopeful that we can all work together to shore up our public education system, not disrupt it by sending funds elsewhere. And in addition, we do need more broadband capability so that through crises like this one, our students at home and our teachers working remotely can be more successful. So thank you, everyone, and I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you tonight.
Thank you. Margaret Dry, you'll be the next speaker this evening.
Hi, I'm Margaret Dry from Plainfield. I am running for state representative in the Sullivan Float District, which is Plainfield and Cornish, Grantham and Springfield, Newport and Unity, and Croydon and Sunapee. I homeschooled all 9 of our children all the way through high school. And I learned there that education is not one size fits all for all students. In this pandemic time, there may be more need in our county for the small classes that homeschooling and some private schools offer. And our county contains a number of private schools who educate well, including online ones, at a lower cost. So there may be things that we can learn from these schools at this time. So I'm here, like Representative Aaron, to listen, and I will, of course, be watching the Supreme Court case. Thank you.
Thank you. Virginia Dry, you'll be next.
Hello, I'm Virginia Dry. I'm running for Sullivan County District 1, which is Plainfield, Cornish, Grantham, and Springfield. I am a junior in college, and I am an online student, and I'm getting a degree in history and public administration. And as a homeschooler, as my mother just said, I was homeschooled all the way from kindergarten to high school. And I'm also dyslexic, so having a very personal classroom as my mother and myself really helped me to focus on what was needed for me and my education. Now, I'm also here to listen to everyone's stories. I was fascinated by the story that was told by the board member of this organization of her experience as a teacher in Newport. And so these stories I always want to hear and want to learn from. And as I do not have specific solutions right off the top of my head, I want to learn what other people suggest first, and to learn about this organization, which has helped, as we saw in the slides, understand what funding goes to which places.
Terrific. Thank you so much for being here. Our next speaker is Claudia Istel.
Good evening. Thank you for having this wonderful program. And I also Enjoy listening to everyone here. I am running for Sullivan 7 in Ackworth, Langdon, Goshen, Leominster, and Washington. I'm an opponent to Judy Aaron, who is here as our state rep. I have taught for over 30 years in public schools, including 30 years in total at Fall Mountain Regional High School. Been a resident of Ackworth for nearly 40 years. I'm now semi-retired. I teach as an adjunct at River Valley Community College. So I have a perspective on school funding as a teacher, a parent, a resident, and a retiree. I have seen a lot of what Stephanie spoke of in the Newport school system as happening in the Fall Mountains district. We have had, I mean, I know I was part of that, so maybe I'm patting myself on the back as being part of it, but our school board administrators, our staff, our teachers, our parents, our community have worked incredibly hard to make the school as successful as it is for a wide variety of students with special needs, with opportunities to attend technical and vocational programs, AP students, your ordinary student, if you will, and it's been amazing, but the cost is very, very hard. It's hard to pass budgets, and while 3 of the towns, Ackworth, Langdon, and Walpole, have property valuations per student that's very close to the state average, 2 other towns, Alstead and Charlestown, are significantly below the state average in terms of property valuation per student, and that sows dissent and division. As we witnessed in the Fall Mountain District last March when Charlestown sought to leave the district. Not everybody agreed with that, but it did come to a head. And I really believe that income inequality is a problem. It's growing in our country, it's growing in our area. Educational inequality is growing in our state because of how we fund public schools. The losers to that are our students. And then the future of our communities. And I strongly believe that public monies belong to fund public education and should not be used to go towards private education. And I think it's going to be a very difficult task to figure out how to fund our schools equitably around the state. We are going to have to look hard at issues, and we're going to have to change some of the priorities of how we do our spending at the state level. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker will be Tanya McIntyre. Tanya?
Hello. Hello. So thank you for this. I'm Tanya McIntyre. I'm running in District 1, which is Plainfield, Springfield, Cornish, and Grantham. My experience with schools is interesting. I've had 2 children in the public schools, and I've had 2 children in private schools. I have 2 children. So they have been in public school, in private school, in public school, and in private school. And through the course of all these years, I have come to the understanding that public money belongs to the public, and it belongs to the education of the public. So public money that is for education belongs for the child. And so I believe that it is vitally important to really look at the cost. And in my experience, I've had 13 years between my 2 kids of private school education. So 13 years is a K through 12 education. And it is equal. It comes out equal in cost for our district. Now, our district is a very, which is the Grantham district, is pretty high as far as the individual per pupil cost. So it might not be comparative to other districts, but in our district, it's pretty close, within a few $1,000s. So I am strongly in support of, you don't become a non-public when your child needs to go to a different program. you don't all of a sudden become, and I feel like I've been punished because my child didn't receive what they needed in the public school. And I have no problems with public schools. I think they're wonderful. I went to a wonderful public school. My mother was a teacher. I substitute teach in both New Hampshire and in Vermont, so I see the difference there. But some children need different things. And as far as like how we fund things, a lot of our public money goes to private organizations. And I feel like in this state, we're uniquely set up. If the state is responsible for the education dollars, then the state should hire the teachers, and teachers should become state employees. And their contracts should be on a scale that is equitable, because the way it's set up now, it seems like each town, if they're a wealthy town, they can offer more money for their teachers. And this is part of the disparity in the education. So I really appreciate, and I get lots of ideas from listening to all of you. And I hope that what I have said that you will think about it. Because again, especially if a child has special needs, the costs go up. And both of my children qualified for special education, and both of them received what they needed in the private sector. So we were very fortunate.
Tanya, I'm sorry to interrupt. I do want to make sure we allow other folks equal time, and perhaps we can come back to you a little bit later if you'd like to wrap up.
I will wrap up with, I hope you listen.
Thank you so much. Our next speaker is Lucius Parshall.
Yes. Thank you for your good work. I'll try and be brief. I'm on, right?
You are, yep.
Good, great, yep. I'm a 20-year public school music teacher, recently retired. My position required me to work across several elementary schools in one district, both donor and receiver towns. And I would love to see that designation buried for once and all. But we need to solve the funding conundrum that has plagued New Hampshire since my first arrival a quarter century ago. There's no doubt that property owners need relief, and there are too many millionaires that use the New Hampshire advantage to the disadvantage of our property holders and our students. At the same time, I'm tired of watching good candidates being tarnished by our press and the taboos around our unwillingness to even discuss alternatives to our current funding system. So, should my first time campaign come to a successful conclusion, I know that I'll be traveling to Concord with much to learn. But I cannot deny that my personal agenda is intertwined with the future of my students and my hope to level the playing field regardless of zip code. Change is going to come. We can either get ahead of the curve and manage it for the good of every citizen in New Hampshire, or sit idly by and drown in its wake. Thank you very much once again for all your good work.
Thank you. Joe Shapiro, you're our next speaker.
Thank you very much, Jeff, for holding this forum. If you come this late in the alphabet, it's hard to not be repetitive. I have not been in the legislature for 28 years like Representative Cloutier, but I have been for the last 2 years representing Keene, Cheshire 16. And it seems to me that this problem with the formula for funding education is the defining issue in our state. There seems to be a scarcity mentality, almost as if we are traumatized by the seeming intractability of solving school funding in an equitable way. And I just want to talk a little bit about the way that ripples out to a variety of other issues. There's a constant refrain in the legislature, which is, we don't have money for that. Whether it's fixing the broken mental health system, whether it's providing dental benefits for adult recipients of Medicaid, whether it's fixing roads and bridges. It seems to me that this problem has us stuck And I think there's an incredible opportunity, which can be enhanced by the commission currently meeting, that if we can solve this problem, that it will open up avenues to solve so many other problems in our state. So I am very optimistic that this will be the year or 2 years that we actually do something. And I personally, I know there are people, there are diversity of views, but my view is that we really need to be open to looking at other ways of raising revenue in order to solve this problem.
Thank you so much. Walter Stapleton, you're up next.
Hi, I'm Walt Stapleton. I'm the current representative for Ward 3, Claremont, Sullivan District 5, since 2018. I came to Claremont with my family in 1983. My field is transportation, and I managed the Claremont-Concord Railroad. And after that, about 1986 or so, entered my own railroad consulting business, and then in 2001 added to that railroad property and casualty insurance, helping to start up railroads and to cover their insurance needs with good coverage. And I was able to conclude that business successfully, having sold it in 2017 and retired. So I was willing to and ready, willing, and able to go into the legislature full-time 100%, and proud to do so, happy to do so, as a give back to the community that gave us so much. My 3 boys were educated in Claremont schools. The Sugar River Valley Tech programs are excellent, high quality, and many of you know my son Greg the plumber got his start at that education point. And my other 2 sons, electrician Patrick and carpenter Ralph, working for Preferred Building Systems, they got a lot out of this education system in Claremont, especially the crafts and skills. So I have an interest in keeping that going. I'm Health and Human Services Committee in the past year, but I sat in on many of the funding education adequacy hearings, and also have attended the numerous Zoom meetings as a public observer, listening to the adequacy and funding work that was going on there. And I'm impressed and pleased with the bipartisan cooperation of all the people on the Education Committee and the work teams. They're addressing really 2 parallel problems. We've got the adequacy defined by the Supreme Court, first and last dollar. And while the Supreme Court said that local control is important, first and last dollar flies in the face of that. So we've got a real tough problem on figuring the adequacy. They're working on it now. And as a matter of fact, they've engaged the American Institute for Research to help with that task. And part of the problem is that with an average of 17.
Representative Stapleton, we do have a couple other speakers that we want to allow a little time of questions. So if you wouldn't mind, if you have a thought you want to complete, we'll move on.
Let me wrap up and I'll pass it along. They came up with a 17,400 average adequate education figure, but the range is like $10,000 to $45,000, depending upon where you are in the state. So they have to make this equitable. And on the other side, funding, our funding from the lottery, $2 billion, we only get 25% of that. So we've got a lot of gaps to fill, but there are places we can look. And I'm confident that the commission is doing work due diligence on both sides of that issue.
Great. We'll talk about that in the Q&A, hopefully. And so our next speaker is John Streeter.
Thank you very much. I'm John Streeter, running for the House in Sullivan District 8, the town of Charlestown. 6 years I spent on the Falmouth Regional School District School Board. I'm currently a selectman in Charlestown, and the whole concept of educational funding and taxation was the reason I ran in 18. It's the reason I continue to run today. It is quintessentially the issue that faces us today. Just to give you a little idea, and if I run over, please cut me off, that's fine. Charlestown is a community. We have Route 12 state access. We have water access on the Connecticut River. We have rail access with a sidecar unloading. We are 30 minutes from an Ivy League university with a teaching hospital. We are less than a 2-hour drive from 5 state capitals. We have some of the lowest property rates of values in the state. And I have watched my property values drop repeatedly. And we're looking at a $300,000 drop this year as well. And it's all based on the tax rate. Our tax rate for education is one of the highest in the state. Add to that the fact that it was just announced to us that our Fall Mountain School District will be looking to pass along to us an 18.9% increase in the New Hampshire retirement, a mere $942,000 increase that we're going to somehow have to absorb along with every other absorption. I could go on a long time. I'm going to not, but I do want to put this out there as we've been talking about, and some people have talked about income tax and sales tax, and I'm not going to come down on one side or the other. But if you want to have a conversation about a broad-based tax, in 2018, I ran some numbers. Total cost of education in New Hampshire was $3.2 billion. Total value of property taxable in New Hampshire that year was $169 billion. You do the math out, and each one of us could have a property tax rate with a broad-based property tax of between $12 and $13 a thousand to pay for all education the way it stands right now. And I don't know about you, but that cuts my property tax in half. I'm not saying a broad-based property tax is an answer, but I am saying that it's unfair what we're running now. And I'm preaching to the choir. But thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you, John. Linda Tanner, you're up next.
Thank you. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, we can.
Thank you. I'm Linda Tanner. I am running for my 4th term at the New Hampshire House of Representatives. I serve on the Education Committee. I've been on the Education Committee for 2 years, and I serve as clerk this year. I kind of feel like I'm at the end, and I wrap things around with Stephanie because Stephanie was a student when I first started teaching. And I watched her go into teaching and spend her career in teaching. I started at Kearsarge Regional High School, and I taught there for 35 years. I live in Sunapee. I'm on the Sunapee School Advisory Budget Committee, so I see that side of it. And I certainly am connected with Newport as well. In the Education Committee, we fought desperately this year to address school funding. That was our top priority, and property tax relief. We managed to take the surplus in the budget from last year and distribute it on the basis of free and reduced hot lunches, because as the commission right now has found out, and people have known for years and years and years, there's a direct correlation between poverty and student outcomes. And so we wanted to influx some money to help property taxes and also to increase school budgets for at least a couple of years, and at the same time create this independent commission, which we finally got through. And they're in their process, as Walt Stapleton said, drawing up a proposal at the end. So how did we get here? Well, we got here because there's been a lot of downshifting of costs. Public education that takes anybody from any religion, any race, any background, any ability or disability, that's public education, and that's where the money should be. Our schools do amazing things, and and try desperately hard to meet the needs of every student. But the downshifting of cost, we got rid of stabilization, building aid went out the window. The state decided not to fund that. The state started a retirement fund when I first started teaching. It was a mandatory retirement fund, and the state promised to pay a certain amount of that. I believe it was 60 or 70%, and now they're whittling their way down to zero. Special education, the federal government promised to pay a certain amount in special education, so did the state. We're down to less than 50% on that. So schools are really hurting. And I'm looking forward to the draft, to the final report from the commission. I'm looking forward to this year working on the education committee again and addressing this problem, keeping an open mind. As many of the speakers have said, there's plenty of ways to increase revenues, but New Hampshire is definitely revenue short, and that's our big issue. Businesses pay more in property taxes, as you heard from Dwight, than they do in business taxes, and yet business taxes have been traditionally cut, and they're a major source of education funding. So there's a few issues that I'm really interested in and involved in and feel fairly knowledgeable in. So thank you.
Thank you. Senator Khan, I neglected to recognize you a little bit earlier if you'd like to speak.
Thank you, Jeff. Jay Khan, I'm a state senator from Keene, represent Cheshire County. And let me make 5 points. I'm a chair of the Senate Education Committee and on the executive committee of the commission studying school funding. The 5 points, to take away 3 outcomes from the AIR study. 1, outcomes are related to student needs, and student needs are economic, language, and special education. Those factors influence outcomes in districts, and those districts that have more students with those needs are going to have lower outcomes. Second, how much is spent per student relates to outcomes. And third, those districts that have the highest tax rates generally have lower outcomes than those with lower tax rates. We have something, the other thing I wanted to mention about the AIR study is that any solution that's proposed in there is merely a model. The solution to balancing these inequalities in the opportunity for an adequate education, balancing that is going to be a legislative decision in this next legislative session, as it always is. What we share in Sullivan and Cheshire County is rural needs and rural development. And without good schools, without adequate health care, we are not going to have rural development in our areas. So how districts spend money, that's local control. That is defined in our Constitution as well. But the state has an issue to solve, and that is, does the state fund outcomes and student and community disparities, or does it fund across the board funding to all towns on an equal level? And that's a decision we can make in the next legislative session. So businesses need educated students, well-educated students. And when we educate students in New Hampshire and they stay in New Hampshire, there's economic growth from that pipeline. We share something in common, and I think that we can have a great influence in the legislative session if we work together on an outcome that funds outcomes and disparities and not across the board allocations per pupil. So I'll leave that, but I'm also going to leave, Jeff, I want to say thank you to School Fair Funding Project. You and your colleagues are adding value to both the Commission's work and to the public discourse. I would also recommend the site that I'm putting into the chat, and I hope that you'll go to the Carsey School. The Commission is not allowed to use any state resources to fund its efforts. So we've contracted with the Carsey School. All of our minutes, all of the resources we've collected in the course of the study are on the Carsey School funding website, and our future meetings. So much like some of the participants have said, and it's great to see all these familiar faces, you can listen in to the Commission's deliberations, and you can also participate in some of our public testimony and information sessions. I encourage you to do so. And our report deadline is December 1st. So we should have something with the Commission's recommendations for the legislature to consider in this next session by that time. Thank you very much for your participation.
Thank you so much, Senator. So we do have a couple moments we do have some time for questions, and want to turn first to the questions that were submitted in advance by folks when they registered. However, if there are folks who are listening in who would like to raise a question, please go ahead and enter it into the chat. So our first question comes from Judith Reed of Keene, and she writes, public education is supposed to be the great leveler, decreasing inequality, but when education is delivered inequitably and in proportion to the wealth of the community, it acts as a great divider, increasing inequality. What do you think needs to be done so that underserved children in poverty-poor districts can receive an education that is at least the equivalent of that enjoyed by privileged children in wealthy districts? So I turn to you folks. Please feel free to just raise your hand, either virtually or physically, and we'll call on you in turn. Representative Stapleton, go ahead.
Well, that hits the nail right on the head, and that's what the court was talking about, equitable. Across the board, one figure fits all doesn't work, and that's what the Education Committee and the study groups are working on. And when they bring the solutions to the legislature for making of law that will hopefully remedy the problem, we're going to have those things in mind to eliminate those low spots and high spots so that everybody can avail a quality education in whatever community they're in. That was a clear mandate by the Supreme Court. First and last dollar by the state, and make it equitable and fair so that we could do the job statewide.
Thank you. Brian Sullivan.
Thank you. I think I perhaps neglected to check a box on some email I got at some point, but I did want to check in. Is it all right for me to say my piece at this point?
Sure, go ahead. If you could speak to the question, perhaps, that I think people would appreciate that, but go ahead.
All right, well, I think I bring a somewhat unique perspective to the table here. I was a teacher for 10 years in Berlin, one of the most struggling school districts in the state right now. And I've worked for 25 years with the National Education Association, representing school districts like Berlin, Franklin, Newport, Claremont, districts that have suffered under the current funding mechanism. And I've also represented school districts like Hanover. Say that I'm looking forward to the final draft of the Commission's report so that we can finally address the funding issues that have been overdue since the original Claremont case 20-some years ago. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there other folks who'd like to share some thoughts about the question that was posed? Why don't we turn to a slightly different question? This was touched on a little bit. Obviously property taxes are a key part of the funding mechanism in New Hampshire, but yet they place a larger burden on low and moderate income folks as well as folks with fixed incomes. If you should be elected to office, would you support changes in law that might help to mitigate the impact of those taxes, and what would those changes be? Linda Tanner, go ahead.
Thank you. I think we've been kind of talking about this through this whole evening. And I think it's that we've got to look at other mechanisms besides or in addition to property taxes. Property taxes are regressive. They're really not a good indication of the person's ability to pay, particularly for people on fixed income and older people that have kept their homes for a long, long time. And I think we can be creative. I mean, I have a great deal of hope for this commission and for the studies that they've done to come out with some equitable funding across the state. And Representative Stapleton mentioned the lottery. That's contributed so little to the education funding, and yet everybody thinks it's a lot because they see that advertisement on TV. But there are many other revenue streams that we need to look at as well. So it's hard to sit down right now and say we're going to take it from A, B, C, D, because it goes through a lot of iterations before it gets there.
Thank you. Are there other folks who'd like to share some views on that topic? John Streeter, go ahead.
Thank you. I wanted to share, I find it interesting. I have family still living in Connecticut, and they are often envious of the New Hampshire model because like a previous speaker had said, Connecticut went through a phase where they instituted a sales tax or an income tax and then never did anything to mitigate the property tax, and both of them ballooned and has put them in a tough situation. I think that whatever we do moving forward, we can find a fairer way to fund the education. But in doing that, you've got to tie it to the reduction of the property tax. And then there are ways that you can, like the Massachusetts Prop 2.5, where you can say, communities are only going to be allowed to raise their property taxes a certain amount each year without, getting a 2/3 vote of their population. It allows communities who want to spend more, but it doesn't allow local governments to see that gap in the property tax if we're able to get a drastic reduction in it and blow it up out of proportion without their constituents knowing about it, really. That's all I have to say. Thanks.
All right, thank you. Joe Shapiro and then Rep. Aaron, you'll be next.
Yes, I do think that we need to consider different revenue streams, and I do think we need to completely reconsider the way we distribute money to different communities. But I think that we also need to just raise our estimate of what an adequate education costs. As your example in the beginning of the program showed, if we went by the adequacy numbers that have been used, schools would have very few teachers and huge class sizes. So I think initially we have to acknowledge that if the Supreme Court says that the state has to provide an adequate education, that $3,600 makes a mockery out of the Supreme Court's decision. And we need to have a more realistic idea of what an education costs and accept that. Thank you.
Thank you. Rep. Aaron?
So in piggybacking to what Joe Shapiro just said, Yeah, we really do need to figure out what is the cost of an adequate education, and see what realistically that number means. But at the same time, I don't hear anybody speaking about why is it that cost per student is as high as $17,000, say in Pittsfield. Why are we not looking at the spending side of it and trying to figure out why is our expenses that high? Why are we not looking at trying to figure out how to minimize some of those expenses? I mean, even in my own household, you have a budget. You look at what things cost to do, and you try and figure out what's a better way to accomplish something to make it less expensive for you. I don't hear any conversation about the spending side of this, only about trying to figure out where we can get more money. And I don't believe that every solution gets solved by throwing more money at it. I mean, are we looking at trying to increase the pie? Or are we trying to look at perhaps getting a better equitable slice of every of the pie? So, you know, I'd like to see, you know, us discuss a little bit more about where, and not necessarily cuts in education, but where we can do better in how we spend our money. Because that's what we do individually in our own home budgets, is try to figure out how to get the best bang for our buck. This is no different.
Okay, thank you. Claudia, were you raising your hand there?
Well, in response to what Judy said, I think that their schools are always trying to cut costs where they can, but it's not just a question of saying, well, you know, can we buy cheaper pencils? It's also I think there are two other issues particularly to keep in mind. And one is, what is involved in educating our children today in the 21st century and to meet all their needs is hugely different than what it was 30 or 40 years ago, and even before that. So it's not only a question of the kinds of education we have to provide, but also the needs our students have for social workers and more counselors. And the more we have inequitable systems where students come to school with more needs, then the school needs to address those. And the other thing is I think a lot of our schools are older and they're not as energy efficient as they can be. And Judy and I were just at the celebration of the Leominster School having a new energy system, and they're anticipating that that's going to save them $10,000 a year. Not every school is going to be able to have a grant the way the Leominster School did or to afford that, but I can tell you what a huge difference it made when Fall Mountain started replacing their windows from single pane windows, or the original windows when the school was built in the mid-60s, to double pane windows. The classrooms were so much more comfortable. And more comfortable classrooms meant that students could focus better, as well as the teachers, and they saved energy. So I think I agree that there are lots of ways we can look at trying to save money, but I don't think the money is going to come from saving. It's not cutting teachers, it's not cutting programs, it's looking at other things.
So Claudia, thank you so much. We're going to recognize Tobin. I believe he has his hand up first, and then we'll turn to John Cloutier.
I agree with her finding ways to make the buildings more efficient. I also believe any funding we do decide on, whether in order to fund education, it needs to be marked for education only, because there's a lot of times, such as gas taxes and things like that, that the argument is we need this for this particular issue, and then the money ends up getting used elsewhere, not just for the reason. That's what I had to say.
Great, thank you. And John, we'll give you the last word unless there are other folks who wish to speak, as we're past our time now.
Okay, okay, thank you. I think it's partly a revenue problem, but one thing I think we need to look at is the number of SAUs in New Hampshire. There's over 100 SAUs now. 40 years ago, there were only about 60. And in Sullivan County alone, as I understand it, we have 15 communities, 11 SAUs. I think we need to seriously consider consolidate. Maybe you have a county, Sullivan County SAU. I put in a bill a few years ago, and it never even, the education committee never even wanted to study it, saying that the districts could work it out. I don't think so. The state pays part of the money. We may need to consolidate it, and that we save a little bit of money on at least administrators. I'd rather cut a few administrators rather than teachers, paras, and people who do the classroom work, the people on the ground. I know this may be not popular with some people, but I think we got to look at reducing the number of SAUs. It's getting ridiculous because all the districts that want to leave form their own SAUs. Thank you.
All right, thanks so much. Well, John, we'll give you one final word, and then we really do need to wrap up.
Oops. That's fine, thank you. I was just going to say that I can appreciate the conversation about finding savings. And I think if we were talking about a state funding education to the tune of $15,000, and the question is, why are some districts at 17? That would be a very fruitful conversation to have. But when you're starting the conversation at $3,600 and looking at the entire state and seeing that nobody, not even the poorest districts, are able to fund education anywhere near $3,600, then having a conversation about how we're going to save some money seems to ring hollow to me at this point.
Thank you. So I do want to thank everyone for being a part of tonight's event. I think we've had a good give and take, and I really appreciate everyone sharing their views. I hope you'll join me all in thanking Stephanie and Dwight for joining us as well and sharing their experiences and insights. I do want to just offer a quick reminder. My name is Jeff McLynch, and we are the New Hampshire School Funding Fairness Project. You can connect with us in a couple different ways. We have our phone number up here, email address, our website is fairfundingnh.org. And as I mentioned, we'll have a video from this event up on our website, hopefully by midday tomorrow. And you can also connect with us on social media, on Twitter at fairfundingnh. I do want to mention, this is a topic that is near and dear to our hearts. And if there's one thing I've noticed about myself and others associated with the organization, we do like to talk, and we do like to talk about education funding in particular. So we would love the chance to come and speak in your communities, and have done so in the past, and really would be interested in doing that again. So if you're part of a community group that you think would like to be a part of this conversation or hear this information, please email us here at info@fairfundingnh.org, and we'll come out to your community virtually for the time being, but hopefully in person before too long, and really just share this information with your neighbors and friends and colleagues. So again, I want to thank everyone for being a part of tonight's event, and we look forward to working with you in the months to come to make New Hampshire school funding system more fair for taxpayers and students alike. And so I hope you all have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.